All right, so today you're beginning lesson 4.1, which is the complete version of everything quadratics, the graphing and all the ways to solve. So some of this you'll know, some of this will be new. First question says, what does it mean to solve a quadratic? It means to get a solution. Well, what does a solution to a quadratic look like? Your solution is where it crosses the x-axis. So lots of times they'll say solve for the quadratic. They'll say find the solution. They'll say what are the roots of your quadratic? What are the zeros of your function? What are your x-intercepts as well? So all of these things mean the exact same thing. Tell me where your parabola is crossing the x-axis, okay? First one, solve by taking square roots. You just took a test on this, and so you're going to be comfortable with these. Y equals 3x plus squared. I already graphed it in Desmos, and so I already know that my answer is -3 and 3. So we're going to go ahead and solve that same problem, but we're just going to use algebra. Let's just say I didn't know what the graph looked like and solving algebra. So you add 27 to both sides. So you're going to get 3x squared equals 27. Divide by 3. X squared equals 9. When you square root it, remember that you take the positive and negative of it. So x is equal to positive and -3. And of course, that's actually what our graph already said. So we're good. Okay, and then again, these are just going to be more practice. So as I go through these, you should be like maybe one step faster than me. Subtract 1. Divide by 2. Square root both sides. Don't forget to take the positive and negative of that. Isolate your quadratic, your x squared, divide by 2 on both sides. Now you can square root it. Take the plus minus of that. Add 3 to both sides. When you add 3 to both sides, you have two equations. You have positive 2 plus 3. And then you also have the negative 2 plus 3. D is the same thing. Add 25 to both sides. Square root it. Take the plus minus of that. When you add 2 to both sides, again, you have positive 5 plus 2. And then you also have negative 5 plus 2. And those would be the biggest mistakes that people forget to take the positive and negative of it. So that is solving quadratics by taking square roots. Notice that how many x's are in the problem? Actually, don't write this down, but there's just an x squared, there's just an x squared, there's just an x, there's just an x. So when there's only one x, most likely you can use square roots. When you come here and you have problems that have an x squared and another x, a couple of them, that might be a different method, but except for B only has one x, but it's still a factoring. So you kind of always want to check to see if they factor first, but that's a good indication that there are two x's, like an x squared and an x. So again, we can see from this problem, I went ahead and graphed it in Desmos, and I see that the solution is -6 and +8. So we're going to go ahead and do that same problem algebraically if you didn't know what the graph looked like. So you're going to go ahead and factor it. And if you recall factoring, there's different methods. So this is two numbers that multiply to get negative 48 and add to get negative 2. So we know it's 6 and 8. And because it's a negative 2, we're going to make that a negative 8. And then, of course, you have to use the zero product properties, which says, well, if these two things multiplied equal 0, then x plus 6 will equal 0, and x minus 8 will equal 0. We'll solve them both. And most of you will just do this step in your head. X equals negative 6. X equals positive 8. And we already actually knew that from that graph. Be careful with the factoring because some directions will say to factor, and if it's factoring, this is your answer, and if it's solving, then you actually have to go one more step. So be careful whether the directions say solve or factoring. This is actually a difference of squares, so this is 5x and 5x, positive 3 and negative 3. When you solve it, and again, most of you will be just doing these steps in your head. This one's a little bit different because you should notice it has that leading coefficient. As soon as it has that leading coefficient, it's going to be a little bit harder. So the first thing you always want to see is, can you factor something out? And luckily for us, we actually can. So everything is divisible by 2. So go ahead and divide that by 2. Make your numbers a little bit easier. So now we're looking for two numbers that multiply to get 15 and add to get 8. What numbers multiply to get 15 and add to get 8? Once you have those, then you're going to use the zero product property. Again, you're just doing this in your head. I'll go ahead and show all the work, set them equal to 0. All right, so that one's not bad. D looks the same, except it's actually going to be a little bit harder. So in this case, I'm looking at this. It has a 3, has that leading coefficient. Don't like that. So is there anything that I can factor out of all those numbers? And there is not. So this is going to be one of those guess and check problems, or how else? We do the box method. I'll just go ahead and do the box method. So multiply these two. So you're going to find two numbers that multiply to get negative 24 that add to get 2, and then you're going to use that to create your box. So this is going to be a little bit more confusing. So what numbers multiply to get negative 24 that add to get 2? Okay, most likely 6 and 4. So you're looking at positive 6, negative 4. Okay, so we're going to put that in our box. The 3x squared goes here. The negative 8 goes here. The numbers that we found go in either one of these diagonals. It doesn't really matter. So 6x, negative 4x. Then I'm going to look at these and say, okay, what numbers can I factor out of those? Okay, they have a 3 in common and an x, so I'm going to factor out a 3x. So 3x times what will give me 3x squared? X. 3x times 6x will give me 2. And then I have to see x times what will give me a negative 4x. Negative 4. It looks good. Last thing I want to do is just kind of make sure, okay, these two multiply, got it, these two. Yeah, all my numbers work. Okay. So then these are going to be your factors. Your factors are you're going to use the zero product property, set it equal to 0 and solve. So you have x equals 4/3 and x equals negative 2. So that was, again, we already did solve by taking square roots, solve by factoring, solve by completing the square. So now we're solving by completing the square. You've actually have done this a little bit before, but, well, you've completed the square, but you haven't actually solved it. So remember that we're going to take half your middle term and then square it. If you like the formula, that's the same thing. And your middle term is half of your b term, all right? So in this case, what we see is normally we'd have y equals, but if we're solving for something, remember solving says that I want to know where it's crossing the x-axis. So you want to know when your y value is 0. And that's the only difference. We had never set it equal to 0 before when we've been completing the square. And then you want to get this over to the other side. So we get negative 12 equals x squared minus 8x because we subtracted 12 from both sides. From here, you're ready to go. You're going to take half of your middle term squared. So half of negative 8 is negative 4. Negative 4 squared is 16. What you do to one side, you do to the other side. So we're going to add 16 to both sides. Now here you write it as a perfect square. I'm going to go ahead and do this step. So two numbers that multiply to 16, add to get negative 8 is negative 4. But most of the time you're not going to be writing that step. You're going to say x minus 4 squared. So you really should be able to go from write that step right into writing it as a perfect square. All right. So now with that we're here, 4 equals the quantity x minus 4 squared. Wait, I already know how to do that. That was solved by taking square roots. So you're just going to square root side, be careful, or square root both sides. When you square root it, you take the plus minus. So now you have positive and negative 2 is equal to x minus 4. Do the math, add 4 to both sides. That turns into positive 2 plus 4. It also turns into negative 2 plus 4. So your answers are 6 and 2. So solve by completing the square. You take half your middle term squared, add it to both sides. We'll set it equal to 0. Complete the square, and then you usually solve by taking square roots at the end. All right, so let's try another one. First thing I'm going to do is, and again, you should try, maybe if you want to pause the video and try to complete this one on your own, or do a couple steps, or mute me and put it on slow motion. All right. Set it equal to 0. Move the 3 over. Complete the square. So half of negative 4 is negative 2. Negative 2 squared is positive 4. Factor this, or write it as a perfect square. Two things that multiply to get 4, add to get negative 4. And again, your last step is going to be to square root both sides. Don't forget to take the plus minus, that cancels, so we're left with positive and negative 1 equals x minus 2. Add 2 to both sides. We're left with 1 plus 2. And then we're also left with negative 1 plus 2. Is 1. So your answers are 3 and 1. And again, if you wanted to, you could actually go and check it. You could also graph it and see that it did cross the x-axis at 3 and 1. All right, go ahead, try another one. Set it equal to 0. Move the 13 over. Take half of your middle term. Half of 6 is 3. 3 squared is 9. Whatever you do to one side, make sure you do it to both sides. Write this as a perfect square. I'm going to skip that step. Square root both sides. Ooh. Okay, this cancels. What is the square root of negative 4? Well, before you guys weren't able to do it. Now you actually can. The square root of negative 4 is 2i. So that's the square root of 4, the square root of negative 1. Or you could probably just write just 2i. Okay. Finish up the problem, subtract 3 from both sides. So your answer is negative 3 plus or minus 2i All right. You should go ahead and graph that to see where it crosses the x-axis if you're curious about what imaginary numbers do, or ask me next class. Okay, so not too bad. The next one, so if imaginary numbers can be same thing, you just have your imaginary number. So if you have a square root of a negative, and then the last one has like a fraction in it. So just be careful with both imaginary numbers and then with your fractions. So what I'm going to do for this one is I'm going to do some side work, and it's actually easier if you leave your answers with fractions than giving it as a decimal. So half of your middle term is the same thing as 5 over 2. And then when you square it, that becomes 25 over 4. Whatever you do to one side, you do to the other side. All right, so then for this part, this is just going to be negative 4 plus 25 over 4. So you could do it with fractions or decimals, and then this side, you're also going to complete the square. It turns out that when you factor this one, this will always be half your middle term. And so that's why I actually kind of like leaving it as a fraction. So that's going to give you x plus 5 over 2. And you would write it as a perfect square. So that's going to be x plus squared. All right. And then you're just going to add that. So negative 4 and 6 1/4. Two and 1/4. Careful with your signs. Okay. I believe that's right. Okay, so again, it's just looking a little ugly, but not too bad. And then go ahead and square root both sides because we're solving for x. So this you have the plus minus square root of 2.25. You know what? Let me rewrite it, and I'll show you right now why I leave it as a fraction. This is the same thing as 2 1/4. If I look at this right now, I don't know what the answer is. But if I were to leave it as a fraction, 2 1/4 is the same thing as 9 over 4. And that I actually can take the square root of. Square root of 9, you can break it apart. Square root of 9 is 3. Square root of 4 is 2. So it's actually plus minus 3 over 2 is equal to x. And most of them, what will happen is that they actually set it up so that you can take the square root of the numbers under there. All right. Not too bad. Okay. So this was a little bit new. You had done a little bit before, but not too much. This is the whole reason for quadratic equations, is that some problems can be solved by using square roots. Those are, I think, are the easiest. Some problems can be used by factoring. That's not bad at all. And then completing the square, you can only complete the square if you have a middle term. If you didn't have a middle term, you wouldn't be able to complete the square because you have to take half of your middle term squared. So if you don't have that middle term, then you're not able to complete the square. And then there's some problems that none of those methods work. Well, if none of those methods work, they came up with a formula. It's called the quadratic formula, and you will have to know that. So if you have an equation of a quadratic in standard form, y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. Quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. All you have to do is take your a, b, c value, plug them in, and then just be careful with your math when you're simplifying. So I took here a problem that doesn't have nice numbers. So x squared plus 3x plus 1, plugged it in, and I found that my x-intercepts are negative 2.6 and negative 0.3 or 0.4. All right, so those two. I'm going to do the same problem algebraically using the quadratic formula. First thing you want to do is find your a, b, and c value. So your a, b, and c value on this one, a is 1, b is 3, c is 1. That should be okay. All right, then we're just going to plug it into the formula. And be careful with your math. So write kind of small, x equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 3 squared minus 4 times 1 times 1 all over 2 times 1. X equals negative 3 plus or minus 9 minus 4 over 2. Keep cleaning it up. That's actually how I would leave my answer. If you wanted a decimal answer, then you would actually plug it in as negative 3 plus square root of 5. And then all divided by 2. And then you would also plug in negative 3 minus square root of 5, all divided by 2. You have to use your calculator for this. And then it would give you a decimal. Okay, and it would give you these numbers up here. Negative, so it's going to be 2. All right, otherwise just leave your number like that. Okay, next one, not too bad. Find your A, B, C value. So your A value is 2, B value negative 3, C value is negative 10. It sounds tedious to write it all down, but until you get really good at these, it's real easy to make a mistake. So just go ahead and take that extra time. Plug it in, X equals negative 3, which is positive 3. Most of you will just write a positive 3. A value is 2, C value is negative 10, all over 2 times 2. Okay, clean it up, be careful. Let's see, it's a positive. Now that looks good, but I will actually mark that wrong. You have to be careful and see if you can simplify your square root. So 98 is the same thing as, so sometimes I'll do side work to simplify the square root. Square root of 98 so this is going to be the same thing as you have to have it simplified, otherwise you'll lose a point for not simplifying it. Okay, so just be careful with that. All right, go ahead and do C on your own. You can pause the video or just mute me and then just check your work and see how you do. Okay, so I'll be a little bit quiet for this one and then just check your work. be careful with your signs because that's an easy place to get it wrong. Okay, and 73 doesn't reduce, so we're good. Leave it alone. All right, one more. Here we go. Okay, go ahead and try this one. So, solving quadratic formula, again, what you would want to do, because when I give you the problems on a test, you're not going to know if it is quadratic formula, if it is factoring, if it is solving by completing the square or solving by factoring. So the first thing you always want to do is, can you solve by taking square roots or maybe factoring? No, can't do that. Can you solve by completing the square? You actually probably could do this one, except it's a negative 7x, so your numbers are going to be a little bit ugly. I had students that instead of doing the quadratic formula, they actually did want to just complete the square. They thought that was easier. I tend to use quadratic formula over completing the square, but it does actually work for this one. So you could do either one on this. All right, go ahead and try to solve this one. I'm going to plug that into my calculator. That is, be careful with your signs. Positive. Okay, so then be careful with how you reduce this. So we ended up with 7 plus or minus the square root of 121 over 2, but the square root of 121 is 11. So this is actually 7 plus or minus 11 over 2. Those are all real numbers, so you're actually going to break it apart into 7 plus 11 over 2. And that's going to be 18 over 2, which is 9. Your other equation is going to be 7 minus 11 over 2. 7 minus 11 over 2. So that's going to be negative 4 over 2, which is negative 2. So again, just making sure that you're simplifying all the way. And these turned out a little bit different. Let's see, I lost my screen. Okay, these ones we're actually going to go ahead and do in class next time. So this is it for your notes for section 4.1. And that's it. Thank you.